Good afternoon. So I'd like to welcome you to our first official event in our speaker series for the 2025-2026 academic year. My name is Kenji Yoshino. I'm the faculty director of the Meltzer Center for Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging. For this event, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished guest, Professor Zeke Hernandez. Professor Hernandez is the Max and Bernice Garchik Family Presidential Professor at the Wharton School. His pioneering research linking immigration to investment and economic growth has won multiple prizes, including 3 Emerging Scholar Awards from the top academic associations in his field. Professor Hernandez is one of the highest rated teachers at Wharton, one of Poets and Quant's World Best 40 Under 40 Business Professors, and one of the youngest recipients of a presidential professorship at the University of Pennsylvania. And most relevantly for today's session, he's the author of the terrific and timely book, The Truth About Immigration: Why Successful Societies Welcome Newcomers, which was released last year. We're thrilled that he has joined us today. Just by joining us for this event, you've been automatically entered into a raffle to receive a copy of Professor Hernandez's book. And towards the end of the program, as always, I'll open up for Q&A. So please submit any questions you have through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to as many questions as we can. So first of all, I think you said I could call you Zeke. So welcome, Zeke, to our center.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so honored that you have me here, Kenji, or Professor Yoshino.
No, please, Kenji. So I want to begin with the phrase in your book where you describe yourself as an accidental migration scholar. I'm always interested when academics are open and transparent about how they came to the work that they do. So could you please kind of unpack that a bit for us and tell us how you got into this field of inquiry?
Sure. And before I answer that, I want to thank all of you who showed up. I don't take it for granted that you're spending an hour here listening to me and others talk. Yeah, so I never intend. I mean, I'm surprised that I ended up being the one who wrote a book on immigration. That's not what I ever thought I would do. The accident is that I never intended to even get into academia to begin with. But when I started my PhD and decided I did want to be a professor, I had zero interest in immigration. I am an immigrant myself. I'm from the little country of Uruguay, but I had no intellectual interest in the subject. I was really fascinated and taken by the question of how one creates economic prosperity, and that had come from formative experiences in early years, having grown up in a handful of Latin American countries and seen a lot of poverty, a lot of suffering. I spent 2 years, two gap years before college doing a service mission in Argentina during the run-up to its worst economic crisis in history. And I saw some serious suffering, women who couldn't feed their children and grown men crying and because they couldn't find work. So you can't see something like that and not be deeply moved by the poverty and suffering and economic disadvantages that people have. So anyway, all of that is to say, I entered graduate school just trying to understand the role that business could play in creating economic prosperity and helping people like the ones I'd seen growing up. And then what happened is, as I really started deep into models of economic growth, they were very technical models about like prices and supply and demand and tax rates and things that are important. But it struck me that what was missing were people. Where are the people in these models? And where is the movement of people? And I realized that if you want things like ideas, investment, innovation that create economic growth, you can't get those without people moving those things across borders and across locations. And that became sort of the spark of what has turned into 20 years of linking immigration to economic growth and business growth and investment. But it was all an accident. I didn't mean to study immigration.
Thank you for that. So in the introduction to your book, you note that the dominant narratives in our public conversation about immigration paint immigrants as either villains or victims. Could you share a bit about what these dominant narratives are, and also why they're wrong?
Yeah, so this is really important, right? The title of the book is The Truth About Immigration, and it's an intentionally provocative title because it's meant to convey that most people have been lied to, right? They have not been told the truth because they've been told one of two stories. Now, we're in a moment where the dominant story you hear from politicians and a lot of news outlets is what I call the villain story. Immigrants are villains that are here to steal your job. They're here to commit crimes and create insecurity. They're here to undermine the cultural heritage of countries. That is, of course, the platform of the party that is currently in power in the United States. But it's not new. It's been around forever, in not just in the United States, but all over the world. And we shouldn't be surprised that there is a narrative that is skeptical and fearful of immigrants. What in some ways I find more interesting is that the alternative is not actually a good alternative or a counter argument to the villain narrative. It's what I call the victim narrative. And that is the idea that immigrants are needy outsiders to whom we have to be compassionate, right? Bring me your tired, your poor huddled masses yearning to be free. It's a very like nostalgic and compassionate message, but it conveys the idea that immigrants are suffering and they need us, and we need to spend a lot of resources and effort to bring them on their feet, but it's the morally right thing to do. I believe that yes, there are many immigrants that fall into that category for a very short period of time, but that narrative has done a great disservice because it's not a good counter argument to the villain story. That is, it could be true that immigrants create a lot of negative things. It could be true that they cost us a lot. And then it comes down to sort of a moral quandary between do we help insiders or do we help outsiders? And in politics, that always ends up working out in the way that it's worked out very recently. The villain story wins, right? Because in a contest between fear and pity, fear will always win. Now, both of those are wrong. They are empirically wrong. This is not just me like making a statement. 20 years of research and decades of research by others have proven that immigrants don't need your fear, they don't need your pity. There's a third possibility, which is empirically true, that it's their net positive contributors to everything that is good for you and your community economically and socially. And I'm sure that's what we're going to get into. But for now, what I'll say is that's very different than villain or victim. Saying that immigrants are good for you, that you and your community need them, that frames them in a very different way, and it allows us to have more win-win possibilities when it comes to immigration.
Yeah, I really appreciated that because it sounds in so many of our prior, speaker series conversations. Chris Hayes came here a couple of years ago and he said, if I, in my 2 p.m. editorial meeting, have like a fear-based story and a non-fear-based story, the fear-based story will always get me better ratings, right? And so I have this ethical dilemma as to whether to choose the fear-based story, which I know is to my own advantage, but may not ethically be good reporting. And then on the other hand, we had speakers from the disability community like, Ben Matlin saying, pity is really a disaster, right, for the disability community. And so I really love this notion of wanting to respond to the villain narrative with a victim narrative, right? But then understanding that both of them are really unpalatable, right? Alternatives, and there has to be a third path. So to delve into that, third path, you divide the book into economic and social aspects of immigration. And you spend a lot of time sort of busting myths in both categories. I really do view this entire book to be an incredibly powerful and useful kind of myth-busting exercise about everything people thought they knew about immigration. But let's start with the economics. One of the most persistent tropes here is that the idea that immigrants take jobs from native-born workers. So what does that idea get wrong? What are we missing here?
Just about everything, right? I mean, it's fundamentally wrong. Now, let me explain why I think it's so intuitive. It's so intuitive because a lot of us learn the laws of supply and demand, in high school or in a freshman level class, right? And so it seems intuitive that, hey, if there's a labor market and you have an increase in the supply of, workers, in this case, because of immigration, right? The labor supply curve has shifted to the right. and all else equal, right, the wages will go down, right? Because all else is equal. The problem is that the way you learn introductory economics is under that all else equal assumption. That is, nothing else has changed. But this is like silly, because when you get a arrival of many people into the economy, not all else is equal. A lot of other things have changed. And this is like what so many people get wrong, including many economists, which is dismaying. The simplest way I can put it is this. When you get an arrival of immigrants, okay, you're getting an arrival of people. Immigrants, as it turns out, they're people, okay? And people bring 5 key inputs into the economy. This is the simplest way I can put it. So if you ever need to talk to your crotchety uncle around the Thanksgiving table, this is how you do it. You put up your 5 fingers and you explain that immigrants bring 5 key inputs. 1, they bring their talent. 2, they attract investment. 3, they bring innovation. 4, consumption. And 5, taxes, right? So talent, investment, innovation, consumption, and taxes. And so when you get an inflow of people, you get a greater quantity of those 5 things. That means that you have a bigger economic pie, a bigger economy. You also have a more diversified economy because immigrants bring a greater variety of these 5 things. That is, they have different tastes and preferences, they bring different skills and talent, they invest in different kinds of businesses. And so you get a bigger and more diversified economy, and a bigger diversified economy needs workers. Everything from the local restaurant needs to hire more waiters, to the factory needs to start a new shift, to immigrants will invest in a new business that is hiring new people. And so then you don't get this zero-sum contest between immigrant workers and foreign workers. You have a bigger economy that needs more people and more inputs. And anyway, that's this, again, the simplest way I can explain why immigrants are. It's not just that they don't take jobs from natives, it's that they create jobs from natives, right? And that's very different. Going from negative to zero is very different than going from 0 to positive. And what immigrants are doing is they're bringing us from 0 to positive by growing the economic pie and diversifying it. Anyway, I think I'll stop there, not to be too long-winded. But if people could understand those 5 things, right? And in the book, I quantify those 5 things, and I'm happy to put numbers on those. But that's once you get that, your whole view on immigrants in the economy kind of gets turned on its head.
Great. I should say that I think we're glitching from time to time in your answers. I don't think we missed anything, but I just want to flag that for you, because I will ask you to repeat something if we lose you for a second there. It's really just a nanosecond, but I just want to flag it. This is actually not one of the places where you glitched out, but just so we have them for the Thanksgiving table, which is coming up, right, in just a couple of months. Can you give us the 5 TTICT points again?
The 5 points again, yeah. So when immigrants arrive, they increase the amount of talent, investment, innovation, consumption, and taxes in an economy. And that's not just in your country, but that's in your neighborhood. And if you want me to add a few numbers to that, I won't bore you with too many numbers, but just some that I think are pretty impressive. When it comes to investment, immigrants are 80% more likely to start businesses than non-immigrants. 80% more likely, right? A lot of those that are going to give you or people you love a job were started by immigrants. And that's not just like your corner ethnic restaurant. We're talking about Zoom, Google, that we're having this meeting because of a business started by an immigrant that employs a lot of people. Those businesses bring investment into your community. They pay both income and corporate taxes. And so you see kind of the ripple effects of just that one thing. I'll give you one more number. When it comes to innovation, and this is really important given the announcement about H-1B visas that just kind of took over the news this weekend, immigrants are responsible for 36% of all patents in the United States, right? That's over a third. That's even more impressive when you realize that immigrants are only 16% of inventors in the US, right? So they're punching at double their weight when it comes to technological innovation. And those patents are literally the difference between life and death for many people, right? It's everything from, medicines, medical devices, but it's also the difference between a more or less comfortable life. like the technologies that make our life simpler. And what's really cool about the research on immigrants and innovation is that it shows that it's not just that immigrants themselves are innovators. By interacting with non-immigrants, those non-immigrants get exposed to new ideas and new ways of thinking that make them more innovative. So it's sort of a win-win for immigrants and natives, that then again, those innovations turn into businesses that employ people, that pay taxes, et cetera. You see the ripple effects on those 5 things.
Fantastic. So just to follow up with another economic idea that you assail in the book, there's another point propounded by Vice President Vance, among others, that immigrants drive up the price of housing. So I was grinning earlier because I literally did take, economics in my freshman year of college. So I'm having flashbacks to the same, supply and demand chart. So could you talk us through that argument? Because it seems like you could make a similar argument about how it's a little bit too wooden to assume that all things are being equal, but the things that change seem to be different, right, from the employment context. So could you talk us through the rebuttal to this argument that immigrants drive up the price of housing?
Yeah, that's again, right, a common argument on the campaign trail and even sort of since then. So this one, I think part of the answer is the same. Not all else is equal, right? But there's a little bit more nuance to the housing thing. So let me start with the part on which people like J.D. Vance have like they're wrong overall, but they have a small point that is correct or worth thinking about. If you have a big inflow of new people, and whether they're immigrants or Californians moving to the state of Idaho, right? You have a big inflow of new people, and that happens rapidly, and the receiving location already has of a tight housing market, more pressure on the housing market. It's true that housing prices can go up and rents can go up in the short run. If this happens very fast. Now, many places that receive immigrants are in areas that are not constrained in housing, right? They might be shrinking, and so it's very welcome that immigrants are demanding more housing. But in an area that's already tight, that's going to happen. Okay, that's a very short run effect. The issue, though, is that the main source of our housing crisis is not enough supply of housing, right? We have more of a supply crisis than a demand crisis. Because remember, our population overall is shrinking, so demand overall is going down in the long run, but the supply is tighter than demand. So the only way you get out of a supply crisis is you have to build more. And who's going to build housing, right? Who provides the labor and the skill to build housing? It's overwhelmingly immigrants, right? Immigrants are over a third of workers. Many have documented, but what's even more, there's key bottleneck skill areas in the construction sectors where immigrants are well over half the labor force. For example, drywall installers, roofers, floor installers, immigrants provide more than half of the labor force. So if you're a construction company, you want to build a new neighborhood, you have everything except the workers to do it, and the government is restricting the inflow of workers, that construction business cannot bid on projects because it's missing key workers in those bottleneck spaces. And so immigrants in the long run are the solution to the housing crunch rather than the opposite. And so by restricting the flow, we're literally making the housing crisis worse rather than easing it, as J.D. Vance claims.
Great. Thank you so much.
Did I glitch?
Yeah, minor one. It's we're sort of trying to sort it out on the back end here, but we'll get
so
there. No
sorry.
worries. Turning to the social aspects of immigration, some critics argue that immigrants don't integrate properly into American culture. So what's your response to that? I'm always haunted by, when in law school, one of my heroes was Justice Harlan, who was a lone voice crying out in the wilderness, for in Plessy versus Ferguson, saying separate but equal was unconstitutional for African Americans. But then in a separate opinion, he was like, oh, Asian Americans are a different matter entirely. They're completely unassimilable to our nation. And, we shouldn't give them birthright citizenship. And so I've been thinking about that, these days when we're talking about birthright citizenship, and also as I was reading your book. So, so getting back to topic here, or focusing in on that topic, you reject this idea that, any immigrant is unassimilable, right, to the nation, or that we can't say that about any immigrant group, to put it more precisely. So please, if you could
Yeah.
give us some talking points on that, that would be extremely helpful.
Yeah, again, and by the way, I want to, I think as we have this conversation, right, in some ways, in many ways, I'm sympathetic to the myth busting idea, but I also, as I write about this, I'm very compassionate to the questions people have about immigrants. I understand where they're coming from, and they're all good questions. Now, some skeptics are more willing than others to hear the answers. But I think it's understandable, right, to see a group of people that has a different culture, a different religion, and speaks a different language, and to wonder, wow, will they really contribute, right, and assimilate? I think it's a fair question. The good news is we have a good answer, and the good answer is absolutely these people not only will assimilate, they do. One of the amazing things about the United States is we have data on many, many waves of immigrants for over 100 years. And what's remarkable is that when you track the rate of assimilation on lots of metrics, whether it's language acquisition, their economic assimilation, whether they move out of like ethnic enclaves, even like the names they give their children. I mean, there's so many ways to measure this. On all metrics, what's remarkable is that whether you're talking about, say, the Irish in the 1800s, the Italians and Jews in the early 1900s, or Indians, Chinese, and Mexicans now, the rate at which they assimilate on all of those metrics is pretty much identical. There seems to be almost like a universal constant rate. Now, of course, a new arrival is going to be different, right? But over time, they converge. They converge successfully to what a native would have in terms of language ability, earnings, cultural adoption of cultural values, voting behavior. And so immigrants, they assimilate successfully. Now, it might be a little bit slower than some people would like. It took them maybe a few years to do that, but they converge. The other thing that's very important, and there's an excellent book about this called Streets of Gold by Leah Bustan and Rana Abramitsky, shows that once you look at the children of immigrants, the next generation, they do phenomenally well, right? By the second generation, not only are the children of immigrants well assimilated, but economically, they're actually more successful than the children of non-immigrants, which means that they become disproportionate contributors to our economy and in other ways. And so once you think of immigration as a process that, yes, takes a little bit of time, but over 2 generations happens, immigrants are very successful in the United States. And what's important is it doesn't matter where they're from. So you might say, well, maybe it was true of European immigrants 100 years ago, but, Asians or Muslims or Latinos are different. They're not. They're literally not. The data shows that they are just as successful as the European immigrants of the past. So we have a lot of reason to be optimistic about that.
Can I push normatively on how desirable assimilation is, though, Zeke? Because it seems like some of your claims about innovation or, punching way above your weight with regard to patents and this kind of 2-to-1 ratio would depend on the fact that you're not assimilating, right?
Yeah.
So is assimilation necessarily like a thing that we should incautiously or absolutely celebrate?
Okay, I'm glad you asked that, because in some ways the second half of the chapter on assimilation really gets at that, which so far what I've addressed is the underlying concern that immigrants don't converge in ways that are desirable. But actually you're keying in on something where you're absolutely right. One thing that's true about the data is that immigrants never converge 100%. Right? They do maintain some cultural values and ideas and tastes and preferences that are a little bit different and sometimes very different than non-immigrants. So the goal actually, and we know this from research on psychology, the goal should not be assimilation, rather it should be integration. So assimilation is sort of a zero-sum contest between the foreign culture and the receiving culture, right? If you move towards one, you have to move away from the other. But as it turns out, research in psychology shows that cultures are not competitors. That is, the same person can be highly attached and highly competent in 2 cultures. This is true of me. I'm an immigrant from Uruguay. I love my Uruguayan culture. I'm very comfortable with it. But after 25 years in the US, I feel very American. I identify with American values. I very successfully navigated American society, and both coexist within me. And integration, meaning not that I gave up my culture, but I adopted a new one and I live with both of them, is actually for immigrants psychologically the best state because they don't suffer the identity crisis of losing something that's important to them. But importantly, it's what you said. With integration, you will preserve some of those differences that bring all those innovations and all those 5 economic benefits that we talked about, right? Those 5 economic benefits come from those very differences. So spot on. And both things can be true. That is, immigrants can converge, but they can preserve differences that are good for us. Yeah, very good. Yeah.
So the final myth I'd like you to bust, also on under the social rubric, is the idea that immigrants drive up crime rates. This myth has been, as we've all seen, a major justification for the current administration's mass deportation efforts. What's the actual relationship, if any, between immigration and crime?
Yeah, so this one, in some ways, this is a softball because I mean, you're right. It's like one of the things that the administration has done masterfully well is convince us that just about every immigrant crossing the border is a criminal. But actually, it's a softball in the sense that empirically speaking, we have the clearest answer on this. So we have, I mean, there's so many ways you could slice the data. So you could look at crime rates comparing immigrants and non-immigrants. You could look at what happens to crime in places where immigrants arrive. There's so many ways to slice the data. Here's basically what you should know, and we're very certain of this. The group with the lowest crime rate in the United States are undocumented immigrants. Okay, and this is nationally or whether you look state by state. To give you some numbers, the state of Texas tracks this the best, and so I'll give you numbers from Texas, but this is largely true nationally. In the state of Texas, documented immigrants are less than half as likely to commit violent crimes, 3 times less likely to commit property crimes, 4 times less likely to commit drug crimes, to be convicted and commit these crimes, okay? And so basically, the safest group you could be around is undocumented immigrants. The group with the next lowest crime rate is legal immigrants. And the group with the highest crime rate always are US-born persons, okay? And this is true nationally. It's also true over time, meaning that as far back as the data goes back to like the late 1800s to now, immigrants have always had a lower rate of crime than non-immigrants. And actually over time, that difference has increased. Right? So it's crime prone than US born persons. Anyway, there's no two ways about it, right? You are safer because of immigration. When immigrants arrive to a place, crime does not increase and sometimes decreases. And so I don't want to be too flippant, but like that is the biggest lie that is told about immigrants. It's just a flat out lie. And so all these people that are being deported and rounded up right now, one of the ways the administration is having a really hard time because their own statistics show that the majority of people that they have detained have no criminal record, right? And so the main justification for their mass deportations doesn't hold up to the very own data that they're publishing. And so that, of course, puts us in a real moral quandary in terms of what our government is trying to do.
Thank you. So you've already sort of presciently gone into this, but I would love to double click on distinguishing between or among different categories of immigrants. So in your answer just now, you distinguished between undocumented individuals and legal immigrants and US-born individuals. So just generally, do your arguments change at all when we're talking about different categories of immigrants more broadly? So, for example, we have lots of students on today. So those who are here on students or on work visas, undocumented immigrants and refugees, or do your arguments apply to all forms of immigration?
Yeah. So let's take those 5 economic benefits that we started with. The short answer is that the economy doesn't care what your visa status is, right? I'm not talking about the moral or legal issue. I mean, those are important distinctions. But from a kind of blind economics perspective, the economy doesn't care, right? Whatever your status is, you can bring talent, you can invest, you can, you pay taxes. Actually, that's a big misconception. Many people think undocumented immigrants don't pay taxes or cannot. They can and they do. So those 5 things that immigrants bring, they don't matter. Now that's the very general statement, and that's empirically true. It is true, of course, that different kinds of immigrants bring more or less of those 5 things. So, for example, those who enter the United States through education, like I did, or many in this audience might have, educated immigrants tend to contribute a lot more to, say, innovation, right? And they do pay more in taxes than less educated immigrants. Undocumented immigrants also bring those 5 things, but economically speaking, the tragedy is that their lack of legal status puts a ceiling on how much of those 5 things they can contribute. One example of this is my barber, the man who cuts my hair. Is someone I've gotten to know over many years. We've become friends. He's an undocumented immigrant. He turns out he's like a very sought after barber. So like there's always a line out the door to get a haircut with him. So he's popular enough that for years he's wanted to start his own barber shop. And one day he told me that he had like $200,000 saved in cash to start his own barber shop, which I almost like fell off my chair when he told me that. And I said, well, why don't you do this? Like I would follow you, and I'm sure all these customers would follow you into your new barber shop. And he said, I can't because of my lack of legal status. It's very risky for me to invest in a business, to buy, a place and all of this. And so that's just an example of like, he's providing value in terms of those 5 things already, but his lack of legal status prevents him from making an investment, which would bring jobs and taxes and other benefits to my neighborhood's economy. But again, he's providing all of those. So that's the short answer. I'm happy to get into more details about specific groups if you want.
I actually, that's really compelling. I actually want to pan out a little bit because listening to you, reading your book, I think it's almost like unanswerable, right? The arguments that you're making. So given the wide-ranging benefits of immigration, both economic and social, that you so painstakingly canvass, I think the question that comes to my mind is less to sort of challenge you or ask you for examples on this argument or that argument, but to ask you, why is the myth that immigrants harm society so pervasive to so many people? So earlier in this conversation, you said, right, you understand this. And I was like, well, help us all understand, right, why there is such a nativist, sentiment. And that is just profoundly irrational, right, given everything that you've amassed.
It is profoundly irrational. That's right. When you know the data, it is. But let me start with why I have compassion for it. So the very first line in the book is a statement that a friend made to me when I was struggling with a decision to move to the US. And I remember talking with an American friend of mine, and he said to me, Zeke, if you come, meaning if you come to the US, you're going to steal a scholarship, a job, and a girl from a deserving American. Okay. That's what he told me. And, perhaps I should have been offended at the implication he was making, but my honest reaction was, wow, he's probably right. Okay. And that's because my prior was that I thought, well, migrating is going to be good for me, but is it coming at the expense of someone else? Am I taking someone else's place? So my point is this, even immigrants worry about this often, okay? And so I think it's normal, right? And I think it's normal because we're somehow a bit hardwired, one, to be suspicious of outsiders, right? We form in and out groups very naturally. And 2, we're also kind of hardwired to think of resources as limited. There's a fixed pie, right? And so we don't want too much competition for that fixed pie. And there's a lot of, anyway, I'm not a psychologist, but there's a lot of psychological research on those 2 things. And so I think a lot of us are subject to those 2 natural inclinations. But here's the part that I think is very important for someone to understand. It's not automatic that we then fall prey to the xenophobia that comes from those two ideas. That is a choice that we make. And that choice has a lot to do with the information environment in which we live. And when it comes to immigration, we are not at all in an information neutral environment, right? Just pay attention to the average story that is told about immigrants, and it's negative. Like, I have data on this, right? The average news story on immigrants is highly negative. Why? Because it sells. Okay. And the other thing is that there are politically motivated groups that have always benefited from the villain message, right? The Trump administration at the moment has been wildly successful with the villain message, but it's been like that before, right? In 1924, we passed the National Origins Act, also by scaring Americans to death about Southern and Eastern Europeans. The Know Nothing Party in the 1800s arose out of fear that the Irish couldn't assimilate. So there's always been groups that, for political reason, exploit and use negative information. And it's just easier to do that than it is to tell the truth, right? So this is going back to your example. I think you mentioned, was it Chris Hayes that you mentioned, Kenji?
Yeah.
So let's go to the Chris Hayes thing, right? So Chris Hayes has to decide, or any journalist has to decide, what immigration story to publish, right? The story of an immigrant murders and rapes a young woman, it will get a lot of eyeballs. We will click on it. It will generate ad revenue, so it's good for business. But that's an exception, right? I mean, yes, that happened. It's horrible. I'm the first one to condemn that act, but it's highly exceptional. The more normal story would be immigrant wakes up, goes to work, does their job, provides a really valuable service, comes home, spends their paycheck, pays their taxes, and has children that are very successful. Nobody's going to buy that story, right? Because it's just routine. It's run of the mill. So we're competing against some psychological hardwiring and the sensationalism, the ease of selling negativity. I wish I had a solution to that. But maybe to say one more thing, is that, let me at least end on a positive note. Research also shows that when people are exposed to immigrants, they like them right away. So just living around foreign-born people immediately leads people to like them. The average American likes immigrants. Nearly 80% of Americans right now today believe that immigrants are good for the country. You wouldn't believe that based on the headlines we see. So there's also a disconnect between like the reality on the ground and the information environment in which we live. All right, I've given you a very long answer, so let's move on.
That was awesome. This actually follows directly on that, which is achieving comprehensive immigration reform has been an elusive hope for decades. Do you think that a more sort of fact-based and less fear-based immigration policy is realistic in the foreseeable future? And if so, what would that look like?
Yeah, great question. I don't know who asked that, but thank you. So it depends on how we define foreseeable. If foreseeable, we're talking about the next 3 to 5 years, I don't think so. I think our politics in the US and actually globally, right? There's a bit of a sort of anti-immigrant virus that has spread since like Brexit around 2016. But in the long run, actually, I'm optimistic about this, and here's why. For one, there is not only does the evidence show that people exposed to immigrants like them, there's also evidence showing that when people are exposed to correct facts, so when someone attends a webinar like this, or hopefully reads my book, or someone else's book, they actually can change their mind. So we need to have faith and belief that sort of correct information eventually will win out, okay? Now, of course, I'm not naive to say that that's going to be easy, but here's why I'm optimistic. Just look at the demographic cliff that we are falling off right now, right? Birth rate's 1.6, well below replacement. Nobody entering our labor force, right? So for example, economically speaking, all new job position, all growth in employment is accounted for by foreign-born people, not because they're taking jobs, but because there's literally no one else to take those jobs. Okay, so US innovation and competitiveness is changing. And by the way, it's not just the US facing this, it's every country in the world. So geopolitical competition for talent and people is growing. So I'm an optimist in that out of sheer demographic desperation, immigration is actually going to be popular again. because we have no choice. I'm not saying in 5 years, but I think in 15 to 20, maybe 25 years. So by the time most of the people here today are about my age, immigration will be a political winner again. And again, because we have no choice. And so the way I'd put it is a little bit like, Winston Churchill's famous line. I'm paraphrasing, but he said something like, America will always do the right thing when it's run out of all other options. And we're a little bit like that with immigration. We're very quickly running into a place where there literally is no other option, demographically speaking. So I believe that in a couple decades, we're literally going to laugh at what our immigration politics are right now. But we have to go through a bit of a rough period, and it's going to be a little dark for a few years longer. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that, calling back to something that we were discussing earlier in this conversation, where I think oftentimes this idea of, oh, immigrants are going to take, our jobs or what have you, is predicated on a zero-sum game mentality. And in some instances, it's like, I'm not so naive to think that there aren't zero-sum game, things like, Chief Justice Roberts said in the affirmative action decision, like college admissions is a zero-sum game. If one person gets into Wharton, another person doesn't get into Wharton.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but it just seems so bizarre, especially after looking at your work, that we would say like immigration into this country is like getting into Wharton, when exactly the opposite is true, right? That there is actually a really deep need for individuals to come into the country, and that one place person is not displacing this other person who's already here.
Yeah, that's so important, Kenji. And this is true in two really profound ways. One of them is, let's take the Wharton, getting into Wharton example. I mean, it's true. Obviously, there's competition to get into something like Wharton, but what's happening with immigration, that's not a very good analogy. A better analogy would be, nobody's being born to apply to Wharton, so the only applicants are going to be, people born elsewhere. So that's one way in which it's not zero sum, because there are no two sides. There's really only one side of population of people, right? Like literally, there's only one side. And that will become more true over time. But there's another way in which is more important. That is, even if there were people on both sides, that is, even if we were in a above replacement level fertility scenario, human systems and economies and societies are not limited resource scenarios, right? So here's what's very interesting. I won't get into the whole story, but the anti-immigrant movement actually comes from an extremist branch of the environmental movement, which is based on the idea of natural ecological systems, like say, the lake in your neighborhood, that does have sort of a limited pool of resources, right? A carrying capacity. It all comes from the notion of carrying capacity. But human systems are not like that, because unlike other animals and living beings, humans can invent and humans can produce more resources. And in fact, if you look at it, history shows that even during an age of a vast, very fast growing population, humans have been the resource that have produced more resources for a bigger population, right? Better ways of producing food, technologies that make it more efficient to produce for more. And so immigrants, because again, that disproportionate role that they have in innovation and creativity, they are often the solution to a lot of the problems that we're afraid of. Again, I don't want to be like Pollyannish about this, but we have to get away from the carrying capacity idea. It doesn't import wealth.
Great. So I could talk to you all day, but we have more than 350 people on the calls, and so I'm going to turn to their questions. I'm going to bundle the first two together because they're related. So the first is, why do groups of immigrants themselves feel negative about other immigrant groups and have these same villain-victim narratives? And then the second question is, I've had experience hearing quote unquote successful immigrants here in the United States say that recent actions against immigration are warranted, as they feel, quote, people should come here the right way like we did, close quote. Have you also encountered this, and wondering what your thoughts are on this phenomenon?
Yeah, those are phenomenal questions, and they're puzzling, right? But they're actually not so puzzling once you if you have been an immigrant. And here's why. So a lot of people ask me, how did all these immigrants vote for, say Donald Trump in the most recent election, right? Knowing like the things he was saying about immigrants. And the answer is very simple. They didn't think he was talking about them, right? Because if you hear, oh, there's these immigrants that are committing crimes and stealing jobs, and they're using public resources and not contributing, because that's not true of most immigrants. A lot of immigrants hear that and they're like, well, that's not me. I'm working. I pay my taxes. I'm not a criminal. None of my cousins are criminals, right? So they're right. They're saying, well, he's not talking about me. But if they believe that there's a subset of immigrants that are doing that, they want to vote for those immigrants not to do that, right? And so it's perfectly rational in their mind, because again, they don't think that they're the ones being talked about. Okay. And so again, one of the great rhetorical successes of in our time, the Trump administration, has been to convince a lot of people that I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about this other group. And why does this happen? Because immigrants want to belong. The thing that immigrants want the most is they want to belong, right? And so one way of belonging is to be like, well, yeah, I'm part of the insider group. I'm the good kind, right? And so I'm voting against the bad kind. Of course, we're now seeing that that's disingenuous, right? That a lot of these people being deported or kicked out or not let in are otherwise law-abiding, hardworking contributors. And there's a lot of people that are shocked by that. I also hear a lot from immigrants who say, well, I did it the right way. This new wave is not doing it the right way. That comes, again, it comes, I think, from a good place of kind of the same mindset that I just mentioned. But there's a fallacy in this. Many of these immigrants that did it, quote, the right way and got in line and entered legally, what they don't understand is that they are one of the very, very few categories of people in the world that has a legal line to get into. If you want to play an interesting game, go to the Cato Institute's website. I'm not a libertarian, by the way, just to be clear, but the Cato Institute has created this brilliant thing called the immigration game. And in the immigration game, you take the role of a randomly chosen person in the world wanting to get into the US. And the game is, can I enter the US legally? And it will be shocking to you in how very few instances you can actually enter legally in the US. Okay, I'll give you some examples. Let's say that you are a farm worker. You want to come to the US. You want to milk dairy cows. You want to work in a dairy farm. The dairy farm needs year-round workers to milk cows, right? It's not like the harvest that happens just for one season. Okay, you have an employer who owns the dairy farm that says, you're a good worker. I want to hire you year-round. Let's do this legally. Guess how many visas we have guess how many green cards, excuse me, we have for farm workers? Zero.
Yeah.
Zero.
I never win this game, so I'm not going to guess.
Yeah, it does not exist. Same for plumbers and carpenters, right? If you're an Indian wanting to get a green card on an EB-2 pathway, you have to wait in line at the current moment nearly 200 years. And that line is going to grow to over 400 years in about a decade. So when you say, the get in line argument is only valid if there is a line and if the line is just. And for so many people in the world, there is no line. And so, they end up having to make a very hard decision, particularly if their safety is at stake. I'm not saying that's the right way to manage the issue, but the answer is we have to change the system. It's a system problem, not an individual bad apple problem.
Great. So these are, thank you, colleagues in the audience for sending these questions. I'm going to bundle 3 of them because they're all themes on the same, variations on the same theme. So one is, your arguments align with my own intuitions about immigration as being good for everyone, including non-immigrants. Do your arguments support removing all barriers to the free movement of people into the United States, or are there some limits on such movement that would be compatible with the arguments that you've made? Second question, similar theme. Do you feel that uncontrolled immigration is better than immigration where each individual is vetted? And then finally, at the risk of flooding the zone here, can there be such a thing as too much immigration? So I think that all of these are kind of themes on, do we want to just open this up completely, or what would the parameters for entry look like if not?
Yeah. So I don't have uh, a super strong opinion on whether we should have open borders or not. I think obviously I strongly believe that closed borders are bad, right? Not only I believe, but that's what the data shows. So a few answers to this. We have had many periods in history, including in the United States, where we have had open borders with the entire world or with vast swaths of the world. For example, many people don't know that until 1965, we had open borders with all of the Americas, right? That's pretty recently. We were not flooded, right, with an uncontrolled wave of people. It was not hard to manage, right? Immigration was orderly, and it sort of responded to basic family and economic needs. And that's been true in many like Europe, right? When Europe has had sort of the essentially open borders for laborers, yes, there have been grumblings of like Poles going to the UK and all that. But what's remarkable is that it's overwhelmingly orderly. And what's remarkable is actually out of all the people that could move, how few do move, right? There's this lay model that everybody who, if there's a richer place and a poorer place, everyone from the poorer place will move to the richer place. And there's, again, many periods where that has been possible. And it's remarkable how few people in the poorer place move to the richer place. That's because we severely underestimate the pull of home, right? Like actually people would prefer to stay with their loved ones in the culture they're comfortable with the language they know. And it takes a lot. It takes a lot to get them to undo that. Okay. So I think that again, I'm not saying that we must have open borders, but what I am saying is that even under open borders, you don't get uncontrolled flows. Second is that anybody that tells you that they know the optimal number of immigrants we should have is lying to you. Right. One of the big flaws in our system of immigration almost everywhere is that we set these numbers, we set these quotas, and in the United States, we set them for 40 years, right? In the US, it's been 35 years since we changed the number and types of visas we allow, 35 years. There's no way that the same number of people we needed in 1990 is the same number of people or the same type of people we need today. So instead of me trying to like act as a genius who can tell you the answer, even for 1 year, my belief, and I think this is realistic, is that the market can tell us more or less how many people we need, right? How many H-1B visas do we need? We actually know. Every year we know, right? As of 2024, it was about 475,000. Why do we arbitrarily only give 85,000, right? We know business are telling us how many they need, right? How many farm workers do we need? We know because farms tell us. So let's set the number based on like reasonable metrics. I mean, we might be off, by a little bit, but it's better than trying to set the number for 40 years in a row. So to summarize, open borders are not going to lead to uncontrolled flows. Nobody really knows the right number, but if we respond to economic and family needs, we can get pretty close, and we don't have to set quotas that are arbitrary. We can just adjust the numbers dynamically. That would be a much better system.
Okay. So I'm gonna bundle two questions that don't have anything to do with each other, but just in the interest of time, would love to get your answers to both. So one is, do you have any research countering the notion that wealthy or white, for example, European, Canadian immigrants can integrate and help the US and innovate and invest, but not the poor migrants coming through the southern border? In other words, do you have anything to counter that, oft-heard claim? And the other one, which kind of tugs at my heartstrings, is what words of wisdom do you have for the children of immigrants, kids and young adults, seeing the awful headlines about relatives and peers?
Yeah, so yes, absolutely on the first one. The 36% number on patents I gave you, I can assure you those are not white European or Canadian immigrants producing all those innovations. Also, Um, yeah, so again, maybe because we're running out of time, read Streets of Gold, right? The evidence in that book will make it very clear that regardless of where they come from, immigrants are very, very successful in contributing in all kinds of ways to the United States. And again, it's not just you're immigrants from a certain background, and so yeah, so the data doesn't support like selecting by race or something like that. We tried to do that, by the way, in 1924. It backfired. Um, and so I'm conscious that I'm running out of time, so I could say more, but I would say yes, there's a lot of evidence on that. Streets of Gold or my book will tell you a lot more about that. For the children of immigrants, in some ways, my answer, it's interesting that you paired those because they're related. Even if you take a Salvadoran or Venezuelan immigrant who's coming through the southern border, desperately poor and fleeing violence, you're going to say, wow, that immigrant, that's going to, it's not as good for America as, say, I don't know, Chinese PhD student. Well, you look at for one, that Salvadoran and Venezuelan will contribute a lot, right? It's true. They might pay a bit less in taxes. They might not do a really high-end job, but they're still doing an essential job that you need. But you take the child of that immigrant, and that child is upwardly mobile, remarkably successful, more successful than the child of a non-immigrant. So if you're the child of an immigrant, thank you for what you're contributing. Now, the last part of the question, yeah, my heart's for the children of immigrant who are being separated from their parents. It's unconscionable, it's un-American, it's immoral. It should not happen, right? There, I'm not going to rely on economic statements. It is absolutely degrading to humanity that we are doing this, and I would have never expected the United States to be the one doing this to families and to children. Of course, there's an economic cost to that as well. But that statement pales in comparison to just the horrendous violation of human rights and family unity that we're causing people. And I'm outraged that we would even do this and do it under the excuse of legality. That's just terrible.
Well, Zeke, I can't thank you so much enough for coming today. We celebrate at our center people who we describe as hard-headed and soft-hearted, and you've demonstrated that in spades today. You've promoted so many other people's work, but today we celebrate you. And once again, your book is The Truth About Immigration: Why Successful Societies Welcome Newcomers. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Wonderful conversation. Thank you all for being here. If I could request a very selfish thing, if you read the book, a simple review on Amazon makes a big difference in making the book go up the ranking so that others will read it and get the message. I care about the message, I don't make any money on these books, but I do care about the message. So if you could review it on Amazon, I appreciate it. But more than anything, thank you for having me.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. We're adjourned.